deep dive into something pretty fascinating today. We're going to be looking at the nature of consciousness and spirituality and the self, all through excerpts from this book, Waking Up, like Sam Harris.
Oh,
You
right.
familiar with Sam Harris?
I am, yeah, neuroscientist, philosopher.
Right. Really likes to tackle these big questions.
Yeah.
And this book is no different. I mean, one of the core arguments is that the feeling of like that sense of a separate self is actually an illusion.
It's a bold claim.
It's a bold claim, and not just like a philosophical idea, but something he says that we can directly experience and investigate.
Yeah, that we can experience it, not just a thought experiment, but something that can be,
Exactly.
yeah, observed and felt and realized.
Yeah, and so to get into this, we're going to kind of follow the thread of Harris's own journey in a way, starting with some early experiences that kind of led him down this path of inquiry. And one of the most striking anecdotes I thought that he shares is about a silent retreat he went on, expecting, profound insights and bliss.
Right, like you go on a silent retreat, you're going to come back and be like...
Totally enlightened.
Yeah.
But instead, he finds himself like craving cheeseburgers and milkshakes.
Yeah, you think like days of quiet contemplation amidst nature, that's going to lead to some kind of spiritual awakening.
Right.
Yeah.
But that wasn't his experience.
No, not at all. And so, I think his experience highlights this really key question that kind of runs throughout the book, which is like, can we actually be happy without external factors?
Right.
Is there a form of happiness that's independent of our, fleeting desires and circumstances? And this seems to be the launching point for his exploration of spirituality, but not spirituality in like the traditional religious sense.
Right. Yeah, he draws a pretty clear distinction between spirituality and religion. Exactly. I mean, he actually argues that people of any faith or even no faith can have these profound spiritual experiences.
Yeah.
And these experiences are pointing to something fundamental about the human mind, something beyond just like dogma and belief systems.
Right. It's not about the story that you tell yourself about it. It's more of like the experience of it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so let's get into, I think, one of the central ideas in the book, this concept of the illusion of the self. And I remember Harris using this really nugget analogy to explain this. Comparing the self to a coiled rope, mistaken for a snake.
Oh, yeah.
Like you're walking in the woods, you see this coiled shape in the shadows, and your mind instantly interprets it as a snake. You get that surge of fear, but then you look closer, you realize it's just a harmless rope, and poof, the fear disappears.
Right. It's the assumption. It's the taking something at face value without further examination. And I think that's a lot of what he talks about.
Totally. And so he's suggesting that our sense of self, that feeling of I, is kind of like that. It's a misinterpretation, a mental construct we've mistaken for something real.
It's the story that our mind is telling us about our experience.
And he brings in some really fascinating evidence from neuroscience to kind of support this idea. And one of the things he talks about is research on split brain patients.
Oh, interesting.
Now, just to remind the listeners, these are patients who've had the connection between the two hemispheres of their brain severed.
Okay.
Usually as a treatment for really severe epilepsy.
Right.
And what's so interesting is that severing this connection can have some, really strange effects on consciousness.
Right.
For example, like their left hand might be doing things their right hand doesn't even know about, or they might give different answers to the same question depending on which side of the brain is responding.
Yeah, it's like two different
consciousnesses.
It's like there's two different minds operating within the same skull.
And here's where it gets really interesting. If something is fundamental as the sense of a unified self can be disrupted by literally severing a connection in the brain, what does that tell us about the nature of the self in the first place?
Right. It really throws a wrench in the whole idea that there's just a single solid I that's running the show.
And so if the self is an illusion, how do we break free from it? And, Harris isn't suggesting we all need brain surgery or anything like that.
Yeah.
He actually points to practices like mindfulness meditation as a way to kind of directly experience this for ourselves.
That makes sense.
He describes mindfulness not as like some mystical practice, but more as like a technique for training attention.
Right.
Becoming more aware of what's happening in the present moment without judgment.
It's like building a muscle.
Yeah. Which, let's be honest, is harder than it sounds.
For sure.
Our minds are constantly wandering, lost in thought. I do this all the time.
Yeah, it's our default mode.
Totally. And Harris even points to a growing body of research that links this, wandering mind with unhappiness.
Oh,
He
interesting.
even shares this really relatable anecdote about a plumbing leak in his house.
Okay.
And he talks about how it wasn't the leak itself that was causing him suffering, but his thoughts about the situation.
Right.
The worry, the frustration, the kind of mental stories he was creating around it.
It's the meaning that we layer on to these experiences, right?
Exactly. And so this highlights the power of mindfulness, like the ability to choose our response to different situations rather than just being totally controlled by our emotions.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And so, Harris is advocating for this, Eastern practice of mindfulness, but he's also pretty critical of traditional Western religions, right?
Right. Yeah.
And I think he sees this key difference between Western religions like, Christianity and Islam, which often rely on dogma and faith, and certain Eastern traditions like Buddhism and Advaita Vedanta. I have to admit, Advaita Vedanta is not something I'm super familiar with.
Yeah. Well, Advaita Vedanta is it's a school of Hindu philosophy that emphasizes the non-dual nature of reality.
Okay.
Meaning that the self and the ultimate reality are not separate. It's a complex philosophical system. But what Harris really draws from it is that these Eastern traditions, including this one, are offering methods for directly investigating the mind.
Okay.
And experiencing these truths yourself rather than just accepting them on faith.
It's like the difference between reading about swimming and then actually jumping in the pool, right?
Exactly, yeah. And it reminds me of that funny anecdote he shares about his friend who went to India trying to be all spiritual, but ended up being mocked by locals for his superficiality.
Oh, yeah. I remember.
He went full-on yogi,
Yeah.
wearing the robes, adopted this kind of strong accent, but it was clear that he hadn't really grasped the deeper meaning of the practices.
Right. It was all surface level.
Yeah, he was playing the part, he was playing dress up.
It's a good reminder that just mimicking the outer forms of Eastern spirituality doesn't really lead to genuine insight.
Right. No, it has to be more than just the performance.
Exactly. It's not about romanticizing Eastern traditions or blindly accepting any kind of belief system, but about finding practices that actually help us see through the illusions that we create about ourselves and the world.
Yeah, about the doing, not just the appearing.
Exactly. All right. Well, I think that's a good place to pause.
Yeah.
We'll pick this back up in part 2.
Okay, sounds good.
Awesome. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too. All right, so we're back, and I'm really curious to dig into this next part. We left off talking about psychedelics and how Harris has explored their potential role in understanding consciousness and the self.
Yeah, he definitely sees them as powerful tools for revealing the fluidity and vastness of the mind, but he's also incredibly cautious about their dangers.
Yeah, he even compares them to a rocket without a guidance system, capable of taking you to incredible heights, but also, the potential to spin wildly out of control.
For sure.
And I remember him sharing a pretty harrowing story, actually, about a bad trip he had on LSD in Nepal.
It's a stark reminder that these substances can be really unpredictable, even for someone like him who's experienced with meditation and contemplative practices.
Yeah.
I mean, he describes hallucinations, paranoia, even a near-death experience in a lake.
Oh, geez.
A far cry from the blissful awakening some might associate with psychedelics.
Yeah, no kidding.
But it's important to note that Harris doesn't view psychedelics as the only path to awakening.
Right.
He sees meditation and other contemplative practices as more sustainable ways to cultivate these insights, even though they might take longer.
Sure, yeah, like he's saying, there are different paths up the mountain.
Yeah.
Some more treacherous than others, but they can all lead to a similar view from the summit.
So if we step back for a moment, we've been talking about the self as an illusion.
Right.
But how do you even study something that might not actually exist?
That's a great question, and Harris acknowledges this challenge. He points out that a lot of scientists and philosophers, when they use the term self, they're using it in this, much broader sense, to encompass the totality of our inner lives, our memories, our emotions, our thoughts, and so on.
But Harris is interested in something more specific, right? That feeling of I that seems to be experiencing all of this.
Right, that sense of being a subject, an observer, separate from the stream of experience.
And he argues that we need to, distinguish between this feeling of I and the various mental states with which it can be associated.
Okay.
And to illustrate this, he brings up some interesting examples, like the case of someone with global retrograde amnesia.
Oh, right. Like the classic soap opera amnesia where someone loses all their memories, their entire personal history.
Exactly.
Okay.
But they still feel like a self, even though they have no idea who they are.
Right. So even without memories, without that sense of continuity with the past,
Yeah.
the feeling of I persists.
It's like the self is something separate from the content of our minds.
Yeah.
And he brings up another really intriguing example, out-of-body experiences, where people report feeling like they're floating outside of their bodies, like observing themselves from a distance.
Which is fascinating because it suggests that even our sense of being located within our bodies can be disrupted,
Yeah.
yet the feeling of I might remain.
Exactly. So these examples really highlight just how slippery the self is
For sure.
and why it's so difficult to, like, pin down scientifically.
Right.
But here's the key point. Harris argues that even though we can't easily locate the self, we can locate its absence.
Okay.
And that, in his view, is the key to spiritual awakening.
Interesting. So it's not about finding the self by, like, dissecting the brain,
Right.
but about experiencing the absence of self.
Through certain contemplative practices.
Got it.
And he even talks about the work of this guy, Douglas Harding, a spiritual teacher who had this profound insight after seeing a self-portrait by the physicist Ernst Mach.
A self-portrait by a physicist.
Yeah, and this is where it gets really interesting for me.
Yeah.
Like, what was so special about this self-portrait?
I'm curious.
Well, Mach drew his self-portrait from a first-person perspective. So it depicted what he saw of his own body, like his chest, his arms, with the rest of the world filling the background. It was basically a visual representation of what it's like to be Ernst Mach.
So instead of seeing himself from the outside, as we typically do in portraits,
Yeah.
he was trying to capture the experience of looking out from behind his own eyes.
Exactly. And this image sparked this realization for Harding that he described as the state of having no head.
Okay, that sounds a bit radical.
Right. Like, was he literally saying he didn't have a head?
Yeah.
Not quite.
Okay.
It's more about recognizing that the I we typically identify with, that sense of being a subject located behind our eyes, can actually be found when we look closely enough.
Huh.
It's like that coiled rope analogy again. The illusion kind of vanishes when we try to grasp it. So
Interesting.
it's like a shift in perspective, a way of seeing through the illusion of a separate self.
I see.
And Harding claimed that this headless perspective wasn't just like a philosophical concept,
Right.
but something that could be directly experienced.
And it seems like this experience of selflessness is at the core of many Eastern spiritual traditions, particularly Dzogchen, which Harris spent some time practicing.
That's right. The Dzogchen, which translates to great perfection, is a Tibetan Buddhist tradition that emphasizes the direct recognition of the nature of mind.
Okay, now I have to admit, I'm not super familiar with Dzogchen. Could
Yeah.
you give us a little, like, ELI5 on this? It sounds pretty complex.
Sure. Imagine looking up at the sky on a clear day.
Okay.
You see the vastness, the blueness, without any effort.
Yeah.
Dzogchen is kind of like that.
Okay.
But instead of looking outward, you're turning your attention inward,
Okay.
becoming aware of the nature of your own mind, its clarity, its openness, its inherent wakefulness.
So it's not about achieving some special state of mind, but about recognizing what's already there.
Exactly. And Harris actually found that this tradition provided the clearest instructions for experiencing the absence of self.
Interesting.
He even talks about his teacher, Tulku Urgyen Rinpoche, and the profound impact he had.
What was it about Tulku Urgyen's teaching that resonated with him?
He compares it to someone pointing out the optic blind spot.
Oh, okay.
You know, that gap in our visual field that we're usually unaware of.
Right.
You might not have even known it existed.
Right.
But once it's pointed out, you can't unsee it.
And just like with the optic blind spot, once you become aware of the absence of self, the illusion is kind of broken.
And that seems to be the essence of what Harris is trying to convey here.
Okay.
It's not about gaining something new,
Right.
but about recognizing what's already present,
Yeah.
the ground of our being. Always there, but often overlooked.
Interesting.
And he suggests that meditation is a way to cultivate this recognition, to become more familiar with the groundlessness of the self.
So it's not about, like, stopping thoughts or achieving some blissful state,
No.
but about seeing through that illusion of a separate self that's grasping at those thoughts and experiences.
This is blowing my mind a little bit.
Yeah.
But it also raises a really important question. If the self is an illusion,
Yeah.
what does that mean for our understanding of morality and ethical behavior?
Right, because if there's no I calling the shots,
Yeah.
who's responsible for our actions? Does selflessness lead to greater compassion and ethical conduct?
Yeah.
Or does it undermine our sense of moral responsibility? These are some big questions Harris grapples with in the book, and ones that I think we need to explore further.
Definitely. All right, well, let's take another quick break, and we'll delve into those questions when we come back for part 3. All right, so we're back and ready to kind of tackle those big questions we left hanging. About the self and morality. Like, if the self is an illusion, does that mean ethical behavior is also an illusion?
Well, it definitely challenges some of our deeply ingrained assumptions about how morality works. I mean,
Right.
our legal systems, our ideas about praise and blame, it's all built on this idea of individual responsibility.
Right. If there's no I making choices, like who's to blame when things go wrong?
Yeah.
Who deserves credit when things go right? It's a pretty mind-bending concept.
Yeah. It is, yeah. And Harris tackles this head on in the book. He suggests that realizing the self is an illusion doesn't negate ethical behavior,
Yeah.
but it could radically change our understanding of what motivates it.
So instead of acting out of pure self-interest or even a calculated sense of altruism,
Right.
could we act from a deeper understanding, like a recognition of our interconnectedness with all beings?
That seems to be what he's pointing towards, yeah. He talks about the possibility of experiencing states of consciousness where compassion and love extend effortlessly to all beings, not just those we're personally attached to.
It's like tapping into this wellspring of empathy that isn't limited by our usual, ego boundaries.
Right.
I mean, he even describes a personal experience he had on MDMA where he felt this, overwhelming sense of boundless love, a feeling that included even strangers.
Wow.
It's a powerful illustration of how certain experiences can, completely shift our understanding of what's even possible
Right.
in terms of human connection.
Yeah, it's like that saying, love thy neighbor as thyself. Right.
Well, what if there's no separate self to distinguish from the neighbor?
It makes you wonder if our usual ways of thinking about morality are actually limiting our capacity for love and compassion.
Yeah, for sure.
But the question that comes to mind for me is, can we cultivate these states of mind without relying on drugs?
That's the big question, and Harris believes we can, though he acknowledges that psychedelics can, provide a perfect glimpse of these possibilities. He sees meditation and other contemplative practices as the more sustainable path.
So it's not about forcing ourselves to feel a certain way,
Right.
but about training the mind to kind of recognize its true nature, which he suggests is inherently free from the suffering we create by clinging to this illusion of self.
It's about letting go of the story, right? The story of me versus you, us versus them,
Yeah.
and recognizing our fundamental interconnectedness.
And he argues that this recognition has profound implications for how we live our lives, how we relate to others, how we approach, the challenges facing humanity. It's a shift in perspective that can ripple out and affect everything.
Yeah, I mean, he's not advocating for any specific religion or dogma, but a kind of secular spirituality, grounded in experience and reason.
Which I think is incredibly relevant today.
Totally.
We live in a world grappling with religious extremism, increasing conflict, existential threats like climate change.
Yeah, and Harris suggests that the insights offered by these, contemplative traditions, especially these insights into the nature of self, could hold a key to addressing these challenges.
It's a bold claim,
It is a bold claim.
but a compelling one, yeah.
If realizing the self is an illusion can lead to more compassion, a wider sense of morality, a willingness to act for the, well-being of all, then maybe these insights are exactly what we need.
Right, maybe the solution to these global problems isn't out there somewhere, but within us.
So what does this all mean for us, the listeners? What are we supposed to take away from all of this?
I think Harris would say the first step is simply to become curious. Explore the nature of your own mind through practices like, mindfulness meditation. Pay attention to how your thoughts create suffering.
And be willing to kind of question your assumptions
Yeah.
about who you are and what's truly possible.
Don't take anything on faith. Remain open to the possibility that there's more to discover.
Yeah, because ultimately, as Harris suggests, the greatest revolution in human history might not be technological or political, but a revolution in consciousness itself.
A revolution that starts within each of us.
Driven by this recognition of our interconnectedness and the illusory nature of self.
Yeah.
And that could be the key to creating a more just, compassionate, and sustainable world.
It's a beautiful vision.
It is a beautiful vision. Well, thanks for diving into this with me.
Yeah, this was great.
A really complex and fascinating topic. Until next time.
Did you get any of that?